Although university is one of the spaces in society today where violence is most discussed and solutions are sought, is it free from violence?
You're listening to Homo Academicus, and today we're going to talk about violence in universities in its various forms and its consequences. So follow our podcast on your favorite streaming platform and send this episode to the friend who is going through a tough situation at college and needs someone to talk to.
One of the reasons why it's so difficult to talk about violence in universities is that we know education, especially public education, is already under so many attacks, whether in the political, media, or social spheres, that sometimes we end up sweeping certain situations under the rug to avoid giving ammunition to those who criticize universities. But if we don't talk about it and don't engage in self-criticism, we will never reflect on how to act in the face of these serious situations that also occur within university environments. Or worse, we may end up contributing to the perpetuation of abuse. This gives ammunition precisely to those who confuse the educational space with a space for the manifestation of power. And this says a lot about what violence is. According to the World Health Organization, violence is not just the intentional use of physical force, but also the use of power to threaten or literally harm, cause suffering and damage to oneself, another person, or a group. From this definition, we can better understand that when someone misuses power in the educational space, they are committing violence. Violence that hurts, that destroys careers, and unfortunately, can even endanger the hope and future of individuals. Following this line of thought, we can imagine that violence will have both individual and social psychological effects. What does that mean? Well, it means that even though different people are in the same space and experience the same violences, the consequences for them will be different. This is because the outcomes, let's say, of violence, depend on complex constructions, the history of these people, the relationships, and how they cope with it. And of course, the consequences will be different depending on the role someone occupies in a violent relationship. They may be the perpetrators, the bystanders, or the targets of that relationship. The studies we are following about violence in higher education will be listed in the references of the dialogue guide we'll leave on the website. And these studies are more specific, which means they analyze specific universities much more than providing general data about violence in Latin America. So, aside from sexual violence against women, which has been the most documented, and we will have data like from the Aban Institute stating that 67% of Brazilian women surveyed said that they have experienced violence in the university context. We can't claim that other types of violence happen to X percentage of students in the region. But at the same time, we know it happens, especially for the more vulnerable groups. These are the Black people, the indigenous people, people with disabilities, immigrants, and others. And even if it happens once or twice in a university, I believe that's enough for us to speak against it. From the studies we're mentioning, 4 possible actors are identified: professors, students, staff, and administrative technicians. And the actions can occur in all directions, between professors, between students, between administrative technicians, between staff, and even between these groups themselves. However, the most common cases of violent actions occur between professors and students. Both ways, actually. Among students themselves and between professors. The authors also add that these violences can be committed by individuals, groups, or even by the institution itself. Now, you might be wondering, wow, how much of this actually happens in universities? Well, the violences identified in cases we've been following. Just a reminder, you can find all the references in the dialogue guide on the website. Identify 6 types of violence, which we will explain and share some stories about. There's physical violence, which is less common but easier to identify. Social violence, which involves behaviors aimed at excluding, isolating, or defaming someone. Virtual violence, where we have similar things but on the internet, like cyberbullying or sharing pirate photos. Property violence, which can involve theft of objects, for example, but also other types of theft, like data theft. You will now hear the story of a person who, for security reasons, prefers not to be identified. and you will hear it by the voice of Ariana Montiel.
So I want to tell you a story of an environmental researcher who worked directly with undergraduate and graduate students who were developing their works. They were doing theses and dissertations within the projects that he was coordinating. During the process of accompanying the students, they were doing fieldwork. The university's resources were used in travel expenses for the fieldwork and also in the research time. All of these included selecting, measuring, and collecting data from trees in a forest that was about 7 hours away from the academic center. All of this was a long, meticulous, and rigorous process that was also physically and mentally exhausting. And during one of the trips, a student told this researcher that he had already had the data to produce the work requested by the college to produce the final paper. But to his surprise, he hadn't done half of what was stipulated in the methodology of the work. And after hearing the researcher say that he lacked the data to do a good job, the student suddenly disappeared with all of the data that he had collected up to that point. And then, without telling anyone, he looked for a new committee and he applied to move to another college. Then he was instructed by this new committee to analyze the data, defend his paper, and he finally published the article under his name and in the name of other researchers who hadn't done the fieldwork.
We also received another report from another person who chose to remain anonymous, and it will be narrated by Ariana.
So, I have known about a case of a defense board that were supposed to evaluate the thesis of a colleague. But in the end, one of the members ended up appropriating the work and they published it under their name. You know, many times the bureaucracy in public universities in my country is a breeding ground for these cases.
Now you will hear from the lawyer Cristiano Murao talking about plagiarism by the voice of Thomas Friseiro.
Bom, plágio. O plágio, todo mundo sabe o que é
Plagiarism. Everyone knows what it is, right? It means it happens quite frequently, unfortunately. Most people tend to focus on the financial aspect of plagiarism, the financial implications of it. What does that mean? When someone takes another person's work, publishes it, and markets it as their own, they're violating the property rights of the original author of the work. But it doesn't stop there. There's also a moral aspect, a dimension that goes beyond the patrimonial matter associated with the author's right. It means that intellectual creations or works protected by copyright are also considered by law, including international regulations to which many Latin American countries adhere, as manifestations of the creator's spirit, an extension of their personality. This grants the author moral rights over their work as well. So, when a work is plagiarized, published, and marketed, it may be infringing not only property rights, but also moral rights. Therefore, someone whose work has been plagiarized can seek legal action not only for financial compensation, but also for moral damages, depending on the specifics of the case.
Another type is sexual and gender-based violence, such as the case of Lesbia Osorio, a student who in 2017 was strangled on the campus of the National Autonomous University of Mexico by her boyfriend, Jorge Luis González Hernández, who was also an employee of the university. The Patricia Galvao Institute states that of the university women it interviewed, 67% had suffered some type of violence perpetrated by a man, 56% had experienced sexual harassment, 28% had suffered sexual violence such as rape, attempted abuse while under the influence of alcohol, being touched without consent, or being forced to kiss a senior. And 36% had refrained from doing certain activities at university out of fear of violence. All of this within the university environment. Listen to the story Deborah Vieira has to share with us.
I had to file a police report because One of my seniors, who was dating my friend, threatened to kill me if he found out she was seeing another guy, and for some reason he was blaming me for it. He even tried to break into my house during one of his outbursts while I was there alone, and I know he assaulted my friend physically and sexually. And after the breakup, he spent years manipulating our classmates or friends through gossip to make people think she was the problem and isolate her. And yes, after filling the police report, nothing was happening. I had to go back to college and attend classes next to him.
And finally, the most common one, psychological violence. This is precisely the second reason we want to point out here as to why it's so difficult to talk about violence in universities. Psychological violence is much harder to identify. It also takes much longer to be noticed because it is normalized. And this is quite serious because people take longer to realize they need help in dealing with this violence, whether it's help from friends, the institution, the law, or a mental health professional. Psychological violence and its normalization are harmful, but we don't need to seek help only when we are already sick. And again, we're not talking about this because we hate universities or because we think universities are places for chaos or anything like that. It's important to make it clear that these situations happen in both public and private institutions, each with their own complexities. Because if we look at companies which have nothing to do with education, they too will have their own dynamics of violence as well as other social structures. But we will focus on the university. And we are going to get into this point because there are real situations we don't want them to happen anymore. And that's why we're addressing it to raise awareness on this topic. In 2024, a medical student from Chile, Catalina Callasaya, took her own life, sparking a major debate in the country about the conditions of students in the healthcare field. In July of the same year, a medical resident from Colombia, Catalina Gutierrez Zuluaga, did the same. The Colombian president Gustavo Petro himself said that this situation shows the rottenness of public policy and the education policy of the healthcare system. The right to health is the closest thing we have to the right to live. The death by suicide and the oppression of residency students shows the neoliberal impact of a system that no longer recognizes the right to be human. The allegations revolve around insults, disrespect, harassment, and humiliation by professors and colleagues, all compounded by the exhausting work hours and low pay in these contexts. The mother of the Chilean student even stated that her daughter had made complaints at the university but was not heard. But why is psychological and symbolic violence the hardest to identify? The main reason is because it happens in an extremely naturalized way, through implicit and tacit rules, so that we don't perceive it. We only feel its effects without often having the slightest notion of its determinants. And how do prejudices like discrimination against sexual and gender diversity will affect students and researchers, even though this is one of the main places for confronting these issues? Where else is there more study and discussion of these violences? A Nature study we found, published in 2018, states that while 34% of men and 43% of women in graduate school are at risk for anxiety, which in itself already says something, the risk amongst transgender people is 55%, with the risk of depression in this group also rising to 57%. For the researchers we are following, it is not that the university favors violence, but rather that it already occurs in other spheres of society, including the family or state violence itself, to cite the case of repression, persecution, and the murder of university students during dictatorships, or in cases that aren't even labeled as dictatorships. So when we go to university, we just bring along what we've already done or we naturalize what happens. And there's another side to it. Education, the professor, and the researcher are so undervalued in our region. There's so much uncertainty in terms of professional prospects that we end up submitting ourselves to certain things because, After all, what else can we do? The very narrative around how special we are for being there, the small percentage of our country's population that made it to university or became a professor, the even smaller number of scholarship holders, how can I complain about something in this context? This often makes us accept many abuses and even the overload.
I used to have a scholarship advisor who, at a time when I was going through a really difficult situation with my family because my sister had been raped and everything was really chaotic at home, he told me that I couldn't miss a day of administrative work because I will have to make up for it later or it will be deducted from my pay. He even told me that I should go to work and that these things I was going through, they were just a part of life. He even made a racist comment to a student during a seminar presentation, suggesting how she should comb her hair, saying the way she wore it was ugly.
This was a report from someone who preferred not to be identified, narrated by Ariana. Thinking to myself, I realized these situations are actually quite similar to the dynamics of an abusive relationship, right? Sometimes it's hard to recognize it at the moment because there are good parts. Oh, he's letting me research these things. I'm getting a scholarship. That keeps us there. But breaking cycles is necessary. And of course, the university is more complex than abusive relationships in this sense because it involves more than just one person. There are many social actors and structures at play. But still, following the analogy with abusive relationships, taking time to heal, reorganize, and move on is also an option. There are healthier spaces, professors who support us. The person from the previous story even told me that during the pandemic, another professor helped her financially. Bell Hooks says that it's important to think about the definition of love, because if we don't, we end up clinging to a definition of love that makes abuse seem acceptable. We confuse a serious commitment with abuse. As in the case of hospital residency internships, abuse, harassment, offenses, and rudeness from superiors is confused with a teaching process. And this kind of thing, which doesn't only happen in the medical field, is accompanied by speeches that say that they're doing it for our own good, so that we can learn something. And in this, we confuse the definition for your own good with abuse in the learning process. And is it different dealing with this kind of thing at the university versus in another type of job?
Depending on the context, I believe so.
You're listening to Beatriz Castro, that you already know from the first episode, in Christina's Jonas Hansson's voice.
Identifying and leaving an abusive situation might be easier in another formal job than at the university. For most who can't afford a private institution or who desire to continue their studies, being at the university, especially a public one, is not just the realization of a dream and a great achievement, but also the possibility and hope of getting a better life. Perhaps in the formal job, it's possible to think about another option, like, I can find another job elsewhere. But giving up on the university is not an option, since it's not that simple to get into another institution.
But is every conflict violence? How can we know the limit between a normal conflict and violence?
Sobre a dimensão do conflito, e muitas vezes os conflitos.
Regarding the dimension of conflict and the tendency to be conflicts in academic life, exclusively from a negative perspective, we have very clear data in the history of psychology showing that these conflicts are increasing. There is an inevitable discomfort when undertaking complex tasks. It is expected to experience some level of discomfort when learning to do something new, like writing a thesis or dissertation. However, we live in a time that promises it is possible to achieve complex things without effort or in a light-hearted way, influenced by the ideology of flexible capitalism and the pursuit of an easy or relaxed life. In this context, we face a significant contemporary challenge for high-level academic training, and not just in academy, but in the development of any individual engaging in highly complex tasks. We know that during the learning process there are inevitable phases of insecurity, dealing with imperfection, criticism, and mistakes. Today we see that younger generations show less resilience when confronted with performance demands, especially when the limitations of their work are pointed out. This represents a serious issue, and addressing it would involve creating conditions where mistakes are considered a natural part of the process rather than as a sign of failure. Encouraging the errors, sharing, and normalization could help make them an integral part of growth, reducing the stigma and fostering a healthier approach to learning.
E não como sinal de fracasso.
You just heard Robson by the voice of Josué, whom you already know. Talking with other people and sharing what we are experiencing is an example of something that can help us understand whether what we're going through is violence or if it's something we need to mature from. And I'm not talking about talking to ChatGPT or with a friend who agrees with everything you do, okay?
Bom, havendo algum tipo de ataque
If there is any kind of rights violation in the academic setting, whether it's related to property, reputation, psychology, or anything else, it's essential to inform the university administration so they can investigate and initiate the appropriate procedures. The issue may be resolved internally within the university. However, if it isn't the case, the judiciary often looks favorably on those who seek an extrajudicial resolution before resorting to legal action. So, there is an important point about involving the university administration.
da universidade. Agora, pode ter ocasiões...
Now, there may be situations where the matter goes beyond the scope of any administrative action. An administrative penalty may not be enough to sanction the offender. For instance, someone who publishes someone else's work as their own. In such cases, even if the university imposes an administrative sanction, it does not have the authority to determine material reparations, such as financial compensation. In this scenario, while it's still advisable to report the issue to the administration, there is no other option but to pursue judicial channels.
This was Cristiano, whom you've already met earlier in this episode in the voice of Thomas. Bell Hooks also wrote that love is what love does. Shall we bring this to education? Perhaps because education is a space about progress, a promise of salvation that it carries. We become so deeply frustrated when we see something bad happening at the university. Love is what love does. The hope for a better life through education must be reflected in the daily practice of our actions. It must transcend the ethics we apply in our conversations with colleagues, whether they are peers or those in a higher position. In the previous episode, we talked a bit about intellectual virtues, such as skills that help us deal with academic life. And now, Ana Becerra, whom you met in the previous episode, will talk a bit more about this, bringing it to the issue of violence in universities.
One way to love is to be generous with our colleagues and students. No one likes to be wrong, but to not embarrass people when they make mistakes, and everyone will make a mistake at some point, it's important to give people the benefit of the doubt. Disrespecting someone else's speech is a form of psychological violence that people lacking generosity often commit. It's important for us to be generous with ourselves and with others. There is a philosopher from the United States, Nicholas Wolterstorff, who says that we shouldn't judge things or people's arguments superficially. According to him, the principle of generosity is not sitting in the judgment chair until we've done our best to understand who is in front of us. It's possible to disagree with generosity. That's why, as he says, we need to have a genuine engagement with the person before us. This, in his own words, involves both an effort to internalize the arguments of opposing perspective, understanding from the inside, and an effort to examine our own position from the outside, testing it for weaknesses.
We'll leave some material on the website with the names of the virtues, a summary of each, and a test that will help you identify which virtues are your strengths and which ones you need to work on. In the same line of thought as Anna mentioned, Bell Hooks, and yes, her again, tells us that recognizing the lack of love we have received implies the need to learn how to love. How can we mix affection, recognition, respect, commitment, trust, honesty, and open communication, these various ingredients that Hooks says are essential to truly love, into our academic practices? When evaluating someone, giving feedback on an article or a final paper, when commenting on someone's presentation at an event, when we encounter a colleague's vulnerability who didn't understand the material, doesn't know the same author I do, or doesn't have the same grasp on a theory, when we're stressed and have to handle a bureaucratic task with the people in the administration office. We also need to bring the reflection back to ourselves, to point out that we too can cause these things or perpetuate some forms of violence, and it also depends on us to intentionally create a loving space. Bell Hooks adopts a definition of love that says that love is the will to extend one's self for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's spiritual growth. And the question that remains for us is, how, in this place where I am today in the university, can I promote my growth, while doing so for the others as well? Promoting the growth of the other, without letting them fall behind? How can I do this without needing to diminish the other to grow in my own career? One of the ways people deal with violence is by strengthening and creating support networks. So I'll take this opportunity to remind you that we will leave a dialogue guide on the website with questions to guide a group conversation on this topic. But let's already give you some ideas for possible actions that can help deal with this. Listen to this tip from Raquel Maya, a psychologist and master's student in psychology at University of Sao Paulo in Brazil.
It's important to remember that violence can have profound individual effects. So if you find that certain violent, complex, or oppressive situation have significantly impacted you, leaving you feeling incapable, inhibited, or persistently and intensely sad, seeking professional help can be an essential step in managing suffering more effectively. We understand that access to professional support can be costly. That's why we recommend exploring options like university clinics, where psychology students in the final stages of their training, under the supervision of experienced professors, offer free services. Additionally, newly graduated psychologists can be an excellent alternative, as they are fully qualified but often charge more affordable fees. It's also crucial to lean on your friends for emotional support during this time, and to take steps to report the violence you've experienced. While it may feel slow or incremental progress, much like the efforts of an ant, such actions can help create a safer and less violent environment for others in the future.
Yes, well, we know that changing structural aspects of our society doesn't depend solely on what we do and our will. On the other hand, we also know that you might believe there's no way to solve these problems, as if things have always been this way. That's why I must tell you that this isn't exactly true. Just as the world and human relations haven't always been as they are today, universities are also constantly changing. That's why we're going to mention 2 ways that we believe are legitimate and potentially effective in combating institutionalized violence in the university environment. The first one is, get together! Join or create groups and committees of students and professors with a political purpose to represent a consensus of thought and goals when defending other colleagues in cases of sexual harassment, for example. This association will ensure narrative cohesion and unity, which reduces the victim's vulnerability when it comes to reporting the incident. Additionally, with an organized and cohesive group, it is possible to apply effective institutional pressure, such as raising the issue in university council meetings, making formal institutionalized complaints, and mobilizing cooperative work fronts to investigate cases. Our second suggestion is propose interdisciplinary debates on these topics via symposia, lectures, study groups, and academic production. The fear of exposure is the greatest weakness of those who take advantage of power structures to create toxic environments and facilitate institutionalized violence. With an active calendar of discussions, you create a structure that keeps the topic alive and ensures that students and professors are better equipped to identify cases of violence and begin organizing. There are ways that can produce effective results, but they require extra energy and a lot of time. That's why we challenge you to also be sensitive to colleagues and acquaintances, to not act violently towards your peers, and to find ways to start a conversation about this issue at the university. And for those of you in a competitive research group or advicees group, where, for example, someone might disappear with the work someone else was submitting, it can be hard to talk about complicated situations with those people because there's simply no space for it. But talking with people from other disciplines or during lunch can be a great way to start building support networks within this context, whether you can share struggles, pains, but also strategies for dealing with them. You can even suggest listening to this podcast together to exchange ideas at the university cafeteria. Having a group of more trustworthy and engaged people can strengthen and encourage you to make reports through the existing channels at the university, or try to draw the attention of the course coordination to the issue. In this process, you might be the person who supports a colleague who has been suffering from violence, encouraging them to take care of themselves and seek ways to discuss the issue if they feel comfortable doing so. The reality is that talking to someone, whether you're opening up or offering a space to listen to a colleague, is the first step in helping someone realize they are not alone. As we saw from the start of this episode, violence in these academic spaces only thrives in silence, when people refuse to discuss it. All our interviews and suggestions today have a main message in common. Do not let this issue be swept under the rug. And we know this is a hard and painful discussion to have. In fact, this third episode is probably the hardest one to listen to in our series so far. But do you understand that we needed to discuss this? We need to bring it to the surface, because this type of violence thrives in silence and misinformation. The work of our team today is to make you more informed and equipped to become an active academic individual. And well, that's all for today, folks. Don't forget to visit the website to check out the resources we've left there for you. In the dialogue guide, you will find all the references we used, both directly and indirectly, to build this episode. On the website, you will also find contact information for online and in-person listening groups for those who want to find more people to talk about the episodes.
You've been listening to Homo Academicus, hosted by Alejandro Ortiz, Spanish hosting by Esteban Muñoz, script and Portuguese hosting by Débora Vieira. Script support by Robson Cruz, Ana Bezerra Felício, and Raquel Maia. Resource support by Ana Bezerra Felício, Débora Vieira, Elisa Ferres, José Almeida, and Raquel Maia. Script review by Frederico Lopes. Media outreach by Elisa Ferres and Lorena Brondani. Editing and distribution by Laura Bieber. Graphic and web design by Amanda Lopes. English translation by Tomás Friseiro. Spanish translation by Débora Vieira. The Homo Academicus podcast is a project founded by the John Templeton Foundation and does not necessarily reflect on the Foundation's opinion. Visit the website at homoacademicus.org to learn more about us and find our resources.